our story with Joseph. And where we left off last week essentially was Joseph going into prison. You remember we back it up a few chapters to chapter 37. We see Joseph's brothers selling him to traders on their way into Egypt. As those traders, the Ishmaelites, come into Egypt, they sell Joseph. Joseph is sold as a slave. And he's sold to Potiphar. Potiphar's house, he became, through the course of time, you remember he was in Potiphar's house for about 11 years. During that course of time, he became essentially the head servant in Potiphar's house. Everybody could tell that the Lord was with Joseph because of how he worked. And we talked last week, if you want to be a good witness, be a good worker. Colossians chapter 3, everything that we do should be done as unto the Lord. And so that's what Joseph is doing. So you have an 11-year time frame, and we'll continue to unpack those 11 years, but you remember he was 17 as we opened up the story with Joseph. So he was 17 when he was sold. We saw that in chapter 37. In chapter 41, we see that Joseph is 30 years old when he is promoted by Pharaoh. And in chapter 40, we see that he was in prison for 2 years. So he was in Potiphar's household for about 11 years, that long for him to grow. And we see the Lord really developing the faith of Joseph. And then we see the wife of Potiphar essentially attempting to lie with Joseph. Joseph refuses. So she comes up with her own story, gives it to her husband Potiphar, who probably, as we discussed last week, doesn't really believe the story, because if it were true, Joseph realistically would have been executed. But we see him instead put in the prison. We see these hard situations put on the lives of a man or a woman of God, and those situations are supposed to better us. Sometimes they do bitter us. But we see that the situation really bettered Joseph. What happened with Joseph? He went into prison. Joseph started a prison ministry. This is where we're starting in chapter 40. Chapter 40 and chapter 41, you're in for a treat. We're going to attempt to do 80 verses in 45 minutes. We're going to see how that goes. Chapter 40 and 41 largely cover his time in prison, but also Joseph's rise to the right hand of Pharaoh. This is also going to be essentially a 2-year process. We're going to pull quite a bit out, not just in context for what's going on with Joseph and around Joseph, but also really for the life of the believer. We like to think that things are going to happen fast and fluid. Our concept of fast and fluid are different than God's. Our way is typically bumpy, where God doesn't have to deal with those bumps. We're bound by time where he is not. We have to come to the place of understanding. Chapter 40 and 41 are really going to draw it out, that waiting. Patience and perseverance really are a large aspect and a characteristic of the Christian walk. So chapter 40, it came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So we see that they're extremely trusted 2 individuals. The butler basically is the cupbearer. He'd been like an ancient secret service dude. He was the cupbearer. He makes sure the king is protected when he comes in the room. He's the one that bears the cup. He's the one, we've seen occasionally, he's the one that might taste some of the food to make sure it's not poison. But these 2 are responsible for the food of Pharaoh. And there's a lot of conjecture and speculation as to why they ended up in prison. Did they cook something bad and serve something bad? That's possible. Or they could have been accused of trying to get rid of the Pharaoh, and so they end up in prison. Either way, Pharaoh's not happy. These 2